has ever heard of him in school? Did you ever hear of him? Yeah, we should be learning more about Latin America, living in California. Anyway, or in the US. Simón Bolívar, that's why the revolutionary struggle and the Republic of Venezuela has been renamed as the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, to follow the ideals of a man who fought colonialism, Spanish colonialism. They feel now that they're fighting another empire, which is the United States. So he started to teach some of his soldiers, and he formed a group of like-minded soldiers, almost a secret organization inside the military. And he was teaching them in the ideas of not only learning their history and about socialist ideas, but about they had to do something. So when the Caracazo happened, he decided we have to speed up the process. We can't just keep studying or getting together and meeting, even though he was in the military. The military, again, which repressed those people in 1989. So 3 years later, Hugo Chavez, following his beliefs, took a group of men who were with him, soldiers, and on February 4, this is a big day now in Venezuela, on February 4, 1992, Hugo Chavez led a military rebellion. And there was a number of tanks that went down the streets in Caracas on that morning in the dawn, dark. But by the end of the day, the battle was losing. He didn't have that many people. He didn't think he was going to win. He just wanted to start the struggle. And at the end of the day, he said to the government, I will tell my men to surrender, but I want to do it on TV. I need to speak to them on television. And he got on TV and he said, I regret that we have to stop the struggle for now, por ahora. He said, I bear full responsibility, but I'm asking my men to put their guns down. And when he said the words por ahora, it meant to the people, and they were watching. He says, for now, it means he'll start it up again. And so they were waiting and waiting for Hugo Chavez. So he surrendered that night, and he was sentenced to prison, a long prison term. But he got out in 2 years. People didn't spring him out. They didn't break into the jail and get Hugo Chavez. What they did was something even more interesting. 1992, he goes into prison, February. In 1993, there's presidential elections. And there was so much popularity. He became a hero in Venezuela. People weren't afraid of that armed attack. They were afraid of the attack that killed 3,000 of their own people. He wasn't afraid of Hugo Chavez's armed attack because he had said, we're going to free the people. It's different. It's a liberating thing, just like Simón Bolívar's wars for liberation. And in that presidential campaign of 1993, certain presidential candidates felt compelled because of the people's pressure who said, we want Hugo Chavez free, that they would say, if I'm elected, I'll free Hugo Chavez. And so Caldera, the next president elected, freed Hugo Chavez. He gave him amnesty. Isn't that interesting? It's not because he liked him, because he was going to maintain the order too. It's because the people demanded it. So you should think about this as an example of people's power. The power of the people who know what's right and who know that they can trust Hugo Chavez. He gets out in 1994 and he begins the work. He starts a new movement, a popular movement that people started to join. He said it shouldn't just be the military, it should be the people too. And he went through the countryside to get to know more of the country, more of the people. And people said, you got to run for president. Well, what were the elections like? They're pretty similar to here. Okay? What is it like? What are the elections like here? You all know it.
A show. Like a show?
A show. What else? How many parties are there?
2.
Well, there's more than that, but they're the only ones you're supposed to know about, right? And if you disrupt one of those 2 parties, like Bernie Sanders, what happens? You gets shut down. Because he was saying things, the powers that be don't want to talk about healthcare, education, you know, and that student debt. You know what I'm talking about. February 4th. He's now buried, he's now in a tomb in a military base up on a hill called El Cuartel de la Moncada, the headquarters on the mountainside. And when you walk up the hill to see his tomb, you see 4F, the February 4th, the day that the country rose up with his action. He gets elected in 1998, and he's inaugurated he takes the oath in February 1999. It's 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you probably aren't even 20 years old.
Some of them.
You're around that age. But 20 years is your lifetime, okay? 20 years is a very short time since he became president. But a lot has happened. February 1999. When he was sworn in, I have the stuff, but I didn't have time to draw it out, so I'll just paraphrase. He put his hand on the Constitution, and he said, "I swear on this moribund Constitution." What is moribund? Moribundo. Someone in Spanish might know more, because it's used more in Spanish. I swear on this moribundo Constitution. You're probably right if you think it's in the top of your head. Pretty much, yes.
Is it crippled, almost dying?
Almost dying, yes, dying. Latinos know the word moribundo more than we know moribund in English. I see that every time. I swear on this dying Constitution, he said, we're going to have a new Magna Carta. Magna Carta means, the Great Charter, a new Constitution. And that very year, they had a new Constitution. It didn't take years. It didn't take fights between Republicans and Democrats. In fact, he didn't belong to either of the two parties in Venezuela. Two parties that held power for some 40 years. And that year, what they did to create a new Constitution, who wrote it? Here, the slave owners wrote the Constitution, right? The property owners, because you also couldn't vote if you were a white man who had no property, and you certainly couldn't vote if you were a woman. But the Constitution was written up by what's called a constituent assembly. Now, I'm going into detail here, but it's really important because when you read the news or when you're going through your life in school, it's good to know these terms because they're processes that happen in other countries that we're not familiar with. You know, we've had a constitution. How many years old? I mean, somebody wants to tell me. 200, yeah, let's say 250, 240 years old. And we find the Supreme Court making decisions that are just horrendous. Horrendous. They interpret depending on who has the power. They're about to decide whether women are going to be able to have the right to abortion, and not really just that, the right to privacy over our bodies and our lives. And we have a very right-wing Supreme Court that's interpreting this Constitution, this or carved in stone Constitution. And here, they had a new one. The Constituent Assembly is when there has to be a body of people who write it, not just political leaders. And what they did was they had an election in the early part of the year, right away. And so people ran. They were mostly working class, from all sectors though, from the countryside, students, a bunch of people got elected when they posted themselves to run. And that body of several hundred people wrote a constitution. They looked at other models, they looked at revolutionary constitutions, they looked at the basics. And this constitution is the first one in a series, because there have been many constitutions in Venezuela. The first one drafted by the people, and the first one voted on by the people, by an overwhelming number, over 80%. And that constitution says that health care Yeah, I do that too. In fact, my phone is kind of reading. Where's my purse? Over here. Okay, that Constitution that still exists today says that healthcare, education, and housing shall be a guaranteed right. We don't have that in our Constitution at all. It just says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it says also that all the resources of the country shall belong to the people, no longer for the benefit of the oil companies abroad, but it shall be used for the people, including all the other wealth, the water, the diamonds, the bauxite. And they have a lot of wealth in Venezuela. It's a huge country, very big country. And it's a revolutionary document. And using that Constitution, they have made many gains. But the U.S. from day one decided this is a threat to our power. Not just because of the oil that we're losing access, unfettered access to. You know, they had access to it, but they were going to have to pay more taxes, and they knew that. But it was also an example that they cannot tolerate in Latin America or the world. It's the same example that Cuba provides, which is a socialist country, which despite being historically underdeveloped and still a poor country, relatively speaking, it's a country where illiteracy was wiped out in the second year of the revolution. Where there's no landlords in Cuba, do you know that? You know that evictions don't exist. You can never be evicted in Cuba. And virtually everybody owns their own home. I could tell you later how that happened, but it was a revolution that made it happen. Where education is completely free, all the way through graduate studies. Where healthcare is not only free, but they send tens of thousands of doctors all over the world to cure millions of people in the 60 years of the Cuban Revolution. But because Cuba is an example, because what could we do here with free healthcare in the richest country in the world? So Cuba has been blockaded by the United States. The United States invaded Cuba in 1961. The United States tried to bomb Cuba to smithereens in 1962 in an operation called Operation Mongoose, but they were stopped by the help of the Soviet Union. Cuba has been under the gun of the U.S., and today, President Trump is also waging an increased aggression in the last few weeks against Cuba because it is socialist, and certainly against Venezuela. He said in February, President Trump got on TV before an operation that they were aiming against Venezuela. He was in Miami, where the Cuban and Venezuelan right wing lives, and he said live on TV, he said, we're going to get rid of socialism in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Well, that means war. And he said, and we will never have socialism in the United States. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because it's more popular than ever, especially among youth. The people are asking. That people supported Bernie Sanders because he said, I'm a socialist. This is what's taking place. So you know what a constituent assembly is, right? It happens in a lot of countries. As a matter of fact, because of Venezuela's example of 1999, the other countries which had also gone through the same process of impoverishment, of pauperization of the working class in Latin America, the people began to look at Venezuela, where the poverty rate was greatly reduced in the following years under President Chavez. And people in Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua said, well, we want a new constitution too, and we want a new government. So socialist presidents were elected in those countries in the years after Hugo Chavez. Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and Evo Morales in Bolivia, with new constitutions and new rights, and also the reduction of poverty. But it wasn't just that those countries had to make it on their own. In 2004, Cuba and Venezuela said, well, let's work together to change all Latin America for the better. And they formed something called ALBA, A-L-B-A. And this is called, it's for the It stands for the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas. And the idea was, let's share our resources. Cuba has tens of thousands of doctors. Venezuela has oil. Cuba has teachers. Other countries have agriculture. So they formed an alliance. I was there in Cuba when both Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez signed the document for ALBA. And pretty quickly, with the elections in those countries, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Nicaragua joined. And several Caribbean countries joined. It was a new day. And one of the projects they had was something called Operation Miracle. And they said, well, we'll do this. With our great number of Cuban doctors, anybody who is blind and has a curable illness, or who has severe cataracts, anybody who wishes in Latin America can come to Cuba with someone to accompany them and have an operation for free. Operation Miracle cured almost 2 million people of blindness and sight disabilities, visual problems, for free through this ALBA alliance. Do you see what it was doing in Latin America? People were like seeing the possibilities. It didn't have to be the way it used to be. But again, as I said, the U.S. decided we can't let Venezuela continue like this. And so very early in his presidency,
you should tell the story of Hugo Chavez going to Harlem, I think, or the Northeast, and offering to provide heating oil for people living in the Northeast in one of the cold winters.
Many programs.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Yes, he didn't just offer it. For several years, the Venezuelan government provided free heating fuel, because in the East, where I used to live for a while, you can have a $400 to $1,000 heating bill in your home over the winter if you have oil. He provided heating fuel to New York City, the Bronx, other poor neighborhoods, to Boston, that was a big recipient, to native reservations, all over. All over, you could have hundreds of millions of gallons were donated. And you would think that those governments, the cities and the governors would appreciate it. No, they never did. They were hostile to Hugo Chavez. But it didn't matter because they still had this sense of solidarity with the American people. Well, there are many other things that Venezuela and Cuba did together. But 3 years, wait, 3 years into his presidency, on April 11, in an action planned and financed by the U.S. and recognized later, April 11 was a coup d'etat. What does coup d'etat mean? It's a coup.
A military invasion of a nation, it overthrows their government.
Yeah, the overthrow of a government, and it can happen by invasion, or it can happen by an internal overthrow. In this case, but thank you, was an overthrow of the government. It's a French word. I don't think we have an English word. I've never heard an English term. We use coup, C-O-U-P, or coup d'etat, which means a blow to the state. In Spanish, it's what? Golpe de Estado. El golpe. Golpe de Estado. Anyway, it started on April 11, and some of the traitorous military leaders kidnapped him and kept him captive. But he came back to office April 13. It was a short-lived coup, and it was unprecedented. We were watching the news in those hours, those days, and the world was stunned to see that Hugo Chavez was brought back. Usually they're killed, usually a dictator comes into being. The man who took office for 2 days, or 3, his name was Pedro Carmona, and he was the head of the Chamber of Commerce. Gives you an idea of what he was representing. Big business. He was the head of the Chamber of Commerce, and he abolished the Constitution and dissolved the Congress, the National Assembly. So that wasn't exactly democratic, what they were planning. And so when the US today is trying to overthrow the president now, the current president, Nicolas Maduro, this is what they would do. They would abolish the Constitution, they would abolish the National Assembly or the National Constituent Assembly, and they would impose, I believe that they would impose a fascist rule. Because so much has been gained by the people that those who want to take power on behalf of the US government, on behalf of US oil, on behalf of the Pentagon, which wants this war, all the powers that be of the United States, if for them to tell the people, we're taking the oil back, you're not going to have the gains anymore, the benefits of what oil brings, then people would fight. And right now people are prepared to fight. Right now the military is strong, 300,000 soldiers, men and women, but they're also formed militias, popular militias, people, the citizens, in their neighborhoods, putting on brown uniforms, tan khaki uniforms, and working side by side with the military, with their neighborhoods to say, if there's any invaders or any war, we will fight to defend our homeland. Okay? You'll see that. Coup. And then he comes back to office. Well, how did he come back? How did he come back? It was on the people's shoulders. The TV stations, the morning of the coup, they put on cartoons on television. You couldn't find out what was going on. In fact, if you want to see a really amazing movie about that time, if you want to see the movie called, write this down because you'll be amazed by it, it's on the internet, is The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. Interesting.
I was just talking about that.
Oh, okay. The revolution, why was it not going to be televised? Because the powers that be, who overthrew Chavez, turned on the cartoons. So you couldn't know what was going on. Shut the news down. People found out by word of mouth. And within hours, in that short time, they came down from the hills, where the poor lived, way up in the hills in these shacks and shanties, and everywhere. And they came and surrounded the presidential palace by the tens of thousands and said, give us back Hugo Chavez. And they did, they succeeded, which showed to them again their power, the power that they have as a people. But then several months later, in the same year, 2002, in a cyber war, a war by technology, the US and plotters inside the country shut down the oil industry. And for 5 months, no oil was produced. When your country depends 95% of its income on oil for the food that's imported, and most food is imported, for all the other goods of the population, well, it was a severe, severe crisis. And it was intended, that crisis of shutting down the oil industry was intended to make people say, we can't take it anymore. Let's get rid of Hugo Chavez. If he's the cause or he's the reason, let's get rid of him. But it didn't happen. They succeeded. They turned back the oil. And in these years has been great development. The Cuban doctors came into Venezuela. Venezuela's healthcare system was private, like much of ours. Most people couldn't pay to see a doctor. And Cuba said, remember the ALBA Alliance will help. And they brought in what is now almost 24,000 Cuban doctors who live 2 to 5, sometimes more years in Venezuela. They leave their families at home and they come to Venezuela to help this revolutionary process. They have clinics all over the country. They provide free healthcare. They have hospitals now. But in the early months of the Cuban doctors coming, they started coming in 2003, the spring of 2003, the private healthcare system wouldn't support it because the doctors were used to making a lot of money and the healthcare system and the profiteers. And so they wouldn't allow these doctors access to the clinics and the hospitals. So what were they to do? Where were they going to work? Well, the government made a call to help from the population, and the women of Venezuela came forth, and they became the support to the doctors. They opened up their humble homes, because it was usually the poorest who were the most sympathetic. And I went to some of those homes where they'd have a little corner a curtain and a desk and a bed where the doctors could work. And then a couple of years later, I went to a rally in the auditorium, big auditorium in Caracas, and Hugo Chavez was calling the doctors, the Cuban doctors in their white coats, the bata, in the audience, and side by side of all these doctors was the women who worked with him. And a number of them became doctors too. But it shows you how the people can respond. I want to say that because right now, the reason I'm saying some of these things in detail is if you read the US media of the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Fox, any media, all of them, 100%, and I say without exaggeration, they're demonizing President Nicolás Maduro, they're demonizing the Bolivarian Project, and they're demonizing Cuba and the Cuban doctors. The US officials like John Bolton and Mike Pence, the Vice President, and Mike Pompeo, they've actually said that Cuba has 24,000 military intelligence in Venezuela. Who did I just say has about 24,000 people? What are they?
Doctors.
Doctors. They're trying to paint a picture like, you must fear. Oh my God. They say the only reason Venezuela is standing up is because the Cuban military is there. 24,000. No, they're doctors. They're doctors. And they're famous for their care in the world. I say this because when you're reading the news, when you leave here, if you read an article, you hear some really outrageous stories. They say people are starving to death in Venezuela. And in February, the U.S. said, we're going to bring aid. I have to go back a little bit to say that not only was the Constitution ratified and approved by election, but in 20 years of revolution, the people have had 23 national elections. President, National Assembly, mayor, governor. You know, the elections that we have. Not the same kind. And in 23 elections, the Bolivarian forces, the revolutionary side, has won 20 of them in approval of, you know, projects, governors, leaders. And the U.S. is getting more angry and more angry. And so last year, remember I said that Chavez died in 2013? Well, right away, there was an election, and Nicolás Maduro, who was a great supporter of Chavez, who was actually at one time his vice president, and he was foreign minister, a man who grew up in the political struggle. He ran for president and he won. He won, and he was known, but he won primarily because when Hugo Chavez was dying of cancer, and as he left a few months before he died to go to Cuba for final medical care, he was on television and he told the people, I ask of you that if there is a need for a presidential election, if the need arises that we have to have new presidential elections, because he knew he was dying. He said, I ask you, as sure as the moon, he said, to vote for Nicolás Maduro. What was he doing? He wanted to prevent that when he died, he wanted to prevent the opportunity that the U.S. would feel they had to try to split the leadership, to try to create divisions, you know, divide and conquer. And he had such authority, he was such a hero, people loved him so much, and they still do, that he wanted to pass on this authority that he had to say, don't be divided, we have to be united. We have to fight together and be united. That's why he named Nicolás Maduro. He was a great man, I knew him since that time. And he won. He didn't win by a whole lot, but he won the majority of the vote. He was president until his term ended last year, and the re-election was up. The electoral process for president was up again, and the U.S. decided we can't let him win, because now the presidential term is not 5 years, but 6 years. And with all that's happened under President Maduro, the great housing projects, millions of homes built for the people, at a symbolic price, almost free. The reform of the prison system, amazing system. The U.S. said we can't have him be president again. So they've created this myth, this lie, this story that he's not really the elected president. And he ran and he won by a bigger margin, 67.8%, a supermajority. But when he was inaugurated in January, the U.S. said, no, you're a dictator, you weren't elected fairly, blah, blah, blah. Was Trump elected fairly, by the way? Is the Electoral College a just system for election? So, Nicolas Maduro is the president. He won again. And he was inaugurated on January 10. But the war, this new aggression by the U.S. began with his inauguration. And on January 10, he's inaugurated. On January 23rd, the day before January 23rd, Mike Pence, the vice president, called this man an unknown in Venezuela, a right-winger, someone from the elite, someone who wants it back like the old days, where the rich were rich and the poor were poor. And this man, who's heard of Juan Guaido? Who has heard of Juan Guaido? Yeah, you probably heard more about it. Because the U.S., he's the president. Mike Pence told him on January 22nd, tomorrow's your day, and we're going to back you. A man who didn't run for president gets on TV and says, I am the interim president. And it's been that way ever since. That the U.S. government recognized him immediately, the Trump administration, and said we'll do whatever we can to overthrow Nicolas Maduro. The U.S. is openly saying he has to be overthrown. And if need be, we'll use military forces. The other day, on April 30th, Guaido tried to start another coup. It was pitiful. It was like about this many people in the room. They tricked about 80 soldiers to join them, and when they found out what was really going on, they left. This is about how many people remained. It was a violent attack. There were some people who died, but it failed because the people do not support the coup. They do not support it, and now the U.S. is talking. If you watch the news, and please watch the news and read it, they say, all options are on the table. Those infamous words to me, we could have a war. It could be a war by military contractors, people who aren't in the military formally but come into the country and wage war, secretly kill people. But that's where we're at, sisters and brothers, that we're going to watch video now. We're going to watch...
I had the director of School of Americas watching a few years ago, and she pointed out that, you know, during the Chavez years, of course, they always questioned whether the elections were fair, but they were certified by the Carter Center, by the United Nations, and the European Union has its own kind of watch group. And so that was always an effective counter-argument. Was the election of Maduro, was that observed by international observers?
Yes. Yes. Yes, but, yeah. Yeah.
The Carter Center or the UN?
Yeah, yes. I don't know about the UN. I'm not the Carter Center. The Carter Center is the former president, Jimmy Carter, who always would say it's a very fair electoral system, free of fraud, but this time they didn't do it because of pressure from the U.S. government. But the process of the elections in Venezuela never changed. It's been the same for 20 years. I want to say something now. We have to be very careful and not to fall into the idea that we as individuals in the United States have a right to decide about other countries' fairness, democracy, or whatever. We have no right to say, it's a dictator. Well, Washington says it's a dictatorship. Washington says that people are starving. Humanitarian crisis, we better get in there. We? Who's we? You mean the military that makes a profit off it? You mean the soldiers who die in war? The thousands who died in Iraq and Afghanistan? The U.S. has wrecked, has destroyed Iraq. Yugoslavia, it doesn't exist anymore. Syria, hundreds of thousands have died by the U.S. saying it's a dictatorship. I was in Iraq, by the way. I made a film called Genocide by Sanctions, where 2 million people have died because of the U.S. war, then blockade of 12 years, then war again, and occupation. Democracy? That's what you brought, or did you bring death and destruction? Because Iraq has huge amounts of oil. Oil that before the US First War was providing free healthcare, free education for the people. Do you know that? No. We're just told, what an awful country. You know, we have no right to decide what is democratic in another country. Because when the US says democracy, it's false when it comes from Washington's mouth. Trump or Clinton or Bush. They don't say that Saudi Arabia is a dictatorship. Didn't they just behead 37 people the other day? Didn't they just, for protesting? Some of them were executed for protesting. And some people said some were executed for being gay. That's Saudi Arabia. When they butchered that journalist, chopped him up, disposed of him, Trump said, yeah, but they're our allies. So let's not fall into that trap, sisters and brothers. We come here with a message. You don't have to be a socialist. You don't have to believe in it. You just have to believe that. Why are we continuing to build a military force that has 800 bases around the world, that has waged one war after another